I had somebody reach out to me and ask if it's possible to install a 3.5mm socket inside of the PlayStation controller that we built for quadriplegic. And the answer is yes, we absolutely can install a connector like this to control any button on our controller that we want to. Now the reason that this person is looking into doing this is because you can connect, if you have the 3.5mm capability, you can connect a switch like this. So this is an on-off switch. It's nothing special, it's just on and off, just like an arcade button would be on our existing controller. Except it has a 3.5mm plug on the end of it, and you could plug it into a socket, and then you could route this switch to other locations that you could use different body parts to operate it. So you might mount it to a wheelchair arm and control it with an elbow, or you could put it in your mouth and bite on it. I know a lot of people use that method. You'd also put it near your head, or use your feet if you know your hands are disabled but your feet still work. There's all kinds of things that you can do with a device like this. Now this is a simple switch. They also make sit puff devices and all kinds of devices that you could connect to a 3.5mm jack. So let's see how we can install a 3.5mm jack inside of our controller. Welcome to Enabled. Before we get started, we need to quickly discuss exactly what kind of 3.5mm jack we want to install, because there are multiple types of jacks. Now a 3.5mm jack, they all plug in the same. The difference is how many terminals they have on the inside of them. So for example, the one I hold in my hand, this is a 4-terminal 3.5mm jack, and it's called a TRRS. So you'll see, if you can see it in the camera, I think it's kind of hard to show here, but there are 3 terminals on the very back of it, and then there's 1 terminal on the top. This top terminal is ground, and then the other 3 are for whatever signals you want to plug into it. Now, this connector that's attached to our simple switch that we looked at, it only has 2 contacts on it. So there's one at the very tip of it, and then there's one at the back of it, and you can tell how many contacts it has because of this black insulating ring. So this black insulator insulates the 2 contacts from touching each other, and that's how you know that this is one contact and that's another contact. So that means that there are 2 wires inside of this cable, which makes sense because this is a simple on-off switch, and you know that when we wired our arcade buttons, they only had 2 contacts on them, one for ground and one for the signal that we send to, in our case, the Brook wireless fighting board. Another example of this is this guy right here. This has 4 contacts on it, so you can see that there are 3 black insulating rings and 4 contacts. So which one you need really depends on what you're trying to do with it. If you want to just use a simple switch like this, you really only need a 2-terminal jack instead of the 4-terminal jack that I have here. If you want to use this to connect an analog joystick, for example, then you need all 4 terminals. You need one for ground, one for VCC, which is the reference voltage. You need one signal for the x-axis and one signal for the y-axis, which is 4 connections total. So that's why I have this jack in my hand. Now, if I were doing it, and this is what I did, I would probably install a 4-terminal jack, no matter how many terminals, how many connections I actually need, because I can still plug a 2-contact switch into my 4-contact jack, and it's going to work just fine. What it's going to do is only 2 of my terminals are going to be useful. So we will only wire up 2 out of the 4 terminals to control a button. And then if you wanted to expand on it later, if you wanted to change that into a analog capability for this 3.5mm jack, all you'd have to do is connect 2 more wires to it and then route them to wherever you needed them to go. So I'll put a description down in the, or a link down in the description pointing you to this guy here, and you can decide what you want to do. Now that we know that, how do we attach it to our box? Now these are designed, this is a bulkhead fitting, and these are really common. They're not hard to get, and they're not real expensive. But these are designed to attach to thin sheet metal. So it's got a nut on it that you would take off. You would drill a hole inside of your sheet metal panel. You would stick the threaded end through the hole in your sheet metal, and then you would thread the nut on the other side, and then that would hold the connector in your sheet metal. Now I didn't use sheet metal, I used 3/4 or 1/2 inch plywood. So the threads aren't long enough for me to attach one of these to my box. So let me show you a way that we can attach something like this to our wooden box without too much effort and without too much extra equipment. What you're going to need to attach this to the box is some kind of thin piece of metal or plastic, something that's rigid. I got a soup can lid here that I'm going to use, and what I'm going to do is cut this so that it's a rectangle. I'm going to drill a hole right in the middle of it, and that's what we're going to mount this connector into. We're just going to put it right in the center, and then we're going to put a hole on each end that's going to make like a flange. So we're going to turn this into a flange that we can then attach to the side of our box. So I'm going to take a pair of scissors. I'm just going to cut it. You want to be careful while cutting thin sheet metal like this, because it is really sharp and it's easy to cut yourself. So it might be a good idea to wear gloves or just be really careful. So it should have something like this. Now let me go drill a couple holes and I'll be back. Here's a result of the homemade flange that I made. So all I did was drill a hole in the center for our 3.5mm plug to go into. That hole size is drill bit H is what I used. It could be a little bit bigger. This one's a pretty tight fit. But this is a 7mm thread, so whatever clearance you need for a 7mm will work. And then I drilled 2 holes, one on each side of the plug that we can use for screws. So I've got some number 6 screws, wood screws here that I'm going to use, and I'm using these screws because I have them. So those will go in here, and that's what we'll screw to our box. Then we need to drill a hole in our box big enough for our 3.5mm, the back side of it, to fit in. So for that, that is a 1/2 inch hole is what I used, and that's plenty big for the 3.5mm to fit inside. So that's kind of what it'll look like. And of course, again, you can use any type of material for a flange that you want. I used a soup can lid, but you could use rigid plastic. You could use, you know, any kind of metal really that's rigid enough that this won't bend too much. If you wanted a whole row of these, you could go to Home Depot or any hardware store and buy metal bar. So they sell aluminum or steel bar that you could get in really long lengths. You could cut that down and you could have a whole row of these things if you wanted to. But for this demonstration, we're just going to stick to the one. So now let's see what we need to do to wire it. Before I start attaching wires to this thing, I need to figure out which terminals it is that I'm going to be using, because I'm only using a 2-contact switch. I need to figure out which of these 2 contacts corresponds to which of these terminals. So on this guy, you'll see that on the top here, there's a terminal, and that's going to be ground. So we already know we're going to want to use that one. So then I need to figure out which of these other three I need to use. So we're only going to use two. One is ground, and then one is going to be one of the other three. So what we're going to do is just plug this switch into our jack. And then I've got my beep meter here. I'm going to set it on beep, so that when the two contacts touch, it's going to beep. And I'm going to touch one contact to the ground terminal, which is the one on top. And then I'm just going to go around to the other three and figure out which one does not beep. So what's going to happen is 2 out of these 3 terminals are going to be connected to ground. So whenever I touch one of them, it's going to beep. So we don't want that terminal. We don't want that terminal. That terminal right there does not beep when I touch it. So that's the one we're looking for. Now that one will beep when I press the switch. So let me get the switch over here. If I press it down, it beeps. If I let up on it, it doesn't beep. See there? So that's how we know which one that we want. Now I'm going to take a Sharpie and I'm going to make a little bit of mark on the side of this so that I remember. That's an indicator of which one I want to solder to. Now let's get some wires. We'll solder a couple wires up to it and then install it in our box. Okay, I've got my soldering iron heating up here. I went and got my wire strippers, and then I got some wire. So let's go ahead and pull out just the length of wire. I'm going to use black for ground, and I guess we'll use that length because that's the end of the roll. So we will strip this. We're just going to strip a little bit off of the end, just like that. And then we're going to pull, let's pull red. We'll do red for positive, black for negative. We're going to do the same thing on this one, just strip a little bit off the end. Then we're going to take some solder. We're going to take the soldering iron. And what I like to do is put a little bit of solder on the tab of the connector first. So I like to tin the tabs, and then I like to tin the wire, and then I like to melt the two together. So what I'm going to do is just take the tip of my soldering iron. I'm not putting any solder on it right now. I'm just going to take the tip of the soldering iron and I'm going to touch it to the top of the terminal that I want to solder to. And that's going to start heating up that terminal. And then I'm going to take my solder, and as that's heating up, I'm going to touch the terminal. I'm not going to touch the soldering iron, I'm going to touch the terminal. And when that terminal gets hot enough, the solder will melt onto it and it'll flow all the way across. All the way across that terminal. Just like that. Doesn't take long, it doesn't take much. And then I'm going to do the same thing to that second terminal that I marked, which is this side right here. Now it is difficult to hold everything and solder. I really need to clamp this down, but I'm going to try and do it without clamping it down. Okay. I didn't get this one very good, so I'm going to try it again. Okay. Then we're going to do the same thing on the wire. So I have a little wire holder here that I'm going to use that I 3D printed just to hold the wire in place. You can also use tape. I often tape the wire down and then use the tape to hold it. So this time I'm going to put the soldering iron underneath the wire and I'm going to hold the solder above the wire. And what that's going to do is the solder is going to melt down through the wire. Just like that. So now the wire's been tinned, and I'm going to do the same thing with the red wire. Just like that. And then I'm going to take the two and I'm going to hold the red wire on one terminal, just like that. And I'm going to press on the top of that wire with the soldering iron. And that's going to melt the two solders together. So I'm just going to take the soldering iron here. I'm going to hold the wire on top of that terminal that we soldered earlier, and I'm just going to hold the soldering iron on top of the wire. That's going to heat up, transfer heat through both of those solder joints, and it's going to melt all of the solder together. I'll lift up on the soldering iron, let it cool, and there I have a soldered joint. I'm going to do the same thing with the ground connection. Hold the black wire to the top of that pre-soldered terminal, then take my soldering iron, press down on the black wire. Doesn't take a lot of pressure, just a little bit. The main thing is just melting both of those solder joints together. Lift up, let it cool, and there you have a soldered connection. So now we've got our audio jack wired up. Now we can install it in our box. Now if you're not comfortable with soldering, I know soldering scares a lot of people. They make solderless connections, or solderless 3.5mm jacks, and I'll put those in the description as well. I don't actually have any, so I can't verify that it will work the way we're mounting it here. But I'll send you a link so you can try those if that makes you feel more comfortable. Let me get some of this stuff out of the way and then we'll install this into our box. Now we're ready to install our homemade flange into our box. So we've got our hole already made. We're just going to feed the two wires. We're going to feed the two wires in our box, and we're going to pull them through from the back side. And then we're just going to put a couple screws to hold our flange in place. Just like that. So now that's a really strong connection, and you can plug and unplug out of that jack all you want. Now I forgot how messy this is, but let's just pretend that you don't see this and focus on these two wires. So then of course, in our setup here, we're using the Brook wireless fighting board. So whatever button you want this 3.5mm jack to control, you would wire it up to the Brook wireless fighting board. So the black wire we wired up to ground, so you would wire that up to a ground connection on either the board or tie it into an existing connection on some of your other buttons. And then the signal wire, which we have as the red wire, you would plug into whatever button you want to use. So if you wanted the X button, for example, on a PlayStation controller, you would just wire this into the X connection on the wireless fighting board. Or if you wanted the option of using the 3.5mm plug or one of the already existing arcade buttons that we have in here, you could tie it in to that button signal. So you just cut the wire, splice it in so both of those are connected. If you want more details on that, check out some of my other videos where I go into full detail on how to install these buttons and how to make multiple buttons do the same thing. That's exactly what we would do here. It makes no difference. This is as far as I'm going to take the wiring on this one. I just wanted to show you the option of using the 3.5mm jack inside of our box. Hopefully this was helpful. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe. Follow along as we do more with these controllers. We've got a lot coming down the line of different things that we're going to do with these. Let me know if there's anything that you need that you think would be helpful. Maybe it'll help us out. Maybe it'll help somebody else out there. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I also dropped a Facebook link down in the description. If you'd like, you can follow along there. It's just another avenue to help get people connected together and get new ideas, share new ideas, and hopefully help more people. So appreciate you watching. Thanks, guys.